Deputy Director, Nehru Memorial and Museum Library, Dr. Ravikant Mishra, to give some opening remarks.
Thank you. Good evening and a very warm welcome to the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. We have a very distinguished panel today. On the panel discussion, Modi 2 Diplomacy for a New India, which is a very, very important subject. Those who have been watching India's foreign policy in the last 5 years or so would certainly agree with the assessment that the foreign policy of India has made great strides in the last 5 years, and there have been some very important changes and a lot of progress has been made. Certainly it is one of the, it is among the best periods as far as diplomacy is concerned in the history of post-independence India. So I'm delighted that Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, along with India Rights Network, is organizing this panel discussion this evening today at Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. We have with us today Shri T.S. Tirumurti, Secretary, Economic Relations, Ministry of External Affairs, as a distinguished guest and a guest of honor. We have Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, India's former Foreign Secretary and India's former Ambassador to Russia and France. Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, India's former ambassador to Italy and Thailand, former Secretary East, Ministry of External Affairs, distinguished fellow VIF. We have His Excellency Hamza Yahya Sharif, Ambassador of Algeria in India, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, India's former ambassador to Jordan and Libya. I extend a very hearty, very warm welcome to all of our distinguished panelists today, and without further delay, now I hand it over to the anchor. Thank you.
Warm welcome to you all once again. Before we start the function, I would like to present a bouquet to our guest of honor, Shri T.S. Tirumurti. Honorable Shri T.S. Tirumurti, Secretary Economic Affairs, Ministry of External Affairs, India, Deputy Director, Nehru Memorial and Museum Library, Dr. Ravikant Mishra, Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, His Excellency Ambassador of Brazil to India, His Excellency Ambassador of Algeria to India, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends. I'm enormously pleased to welcome you all to this panel discussion on Modi 2.0 Diplomacy for a New India to mark the publication of special edition of India and the World magazine. At the very outset, I would like to express my deep gratitude to Mr. Tirumurti for taking time off from his extremely packed schedule to accept this invitation to deliver the keynote address on an important theme which impinges on India's development journey and the country's foreign policy choices. I would also like to thank eminent panelists and ambassadors of Brazil and Algeria to accept our invitation on a short notice and be here with us. Before I lay out the thematic canvas of today's panel discussion, let me say a few words about India and the World magazine and our organization, TZII Media Private Limited. Driven by a highly qualified and motivated team of senior journalists, foreign policy experts, and publishing professionals, TZII Media's core areas of business operations include media, publishing, research, consultancy, and advocacy. We launched India and the World magazine over 2 years ago with the overarching objective of providing an agenda-free narrative and perspectives on global issues and developments from India's point of view. By India's point of view, we do not mean a nationalistic narrative, but are only underlining that given India's growing international profile, its economic weight and expanding global engagements, the world today has huge stakes in understanding India's worldview and narrative. And the narrative, as we all know, is becoming all the more important in the post-truth world of fake news and impresarios posing as savants. We have largely adhered to this self-imposed mandate of providing the long view on key global issues which transcend 24/7 television chatter and hysteria that obfuscate the picture rather than illuminate it. As we move on from here, we'll need your support and encouragement. To guide us on this journey, we have set up a board of advisors which comprise eminent diplomats and domain experts. These include, among others, Ambassador Kanwal Sibbal, Ambassador Wadhwa, Ambassador Bambawale, Ambassador Trigunayal, Professor Srikant Kondapalli, and Mr. Pranav Kumar of CII. Now let me briefly outline the master theme of today's panel discussion. We are meeting at a time when the old order and way of doing diplomacy and business is crumbling, but the outlines of a new order are at best nebulous. The only certainty, as they say, is uncertainty. Against this backdrop of aggravating rivalries between leading powers, established powers, and emerging powers, India has chosen the path of multi-alignment, which entails forging issue-based alignments with like-minded countries and major power centers without getting into us versus them zero-sum games. The first few months of the second term of this government saw Prime Minister Modi holding summits with the leaders of the US, China, and Russia. In fact, it's not hard to visualize that on the same day, India's Prime Minister can hold meetings with their counterparts from the US, China, and Russia, and still find time for other plurilateral and multilateral meets. In a rapidly changing world and shifting equations among major and middle powers, what we are discussing today are India's choices. How does an emerging country like India actualize its potential as a global power, not for the sake of geopolitical games, but for transforming the lives of over 1.3 billion people? In this regard, the spectacular electoral victory in the May 2019 elections has placed Prime Minister Narendra Modi in a unique position to not only set the domestic agenda for India's transformation, but also to spur India's ongoing rise on the global stage. The historic mandate has enhanced Modi's global stature and looks set to positively impact India's foreign policy choices and postures in the next 5 years. As Modi himself has indicated, the overarching thrust of the Modi 2.0 foreign policy will be to harness the network of India's partnerships with major and middle powers to create a new India by 2022, the 75th anniversary of India's independence. Now, what does this spectacular mandate mean for India's foreign policy and diplomatic practice? Can we expect a greater focus on economic diplomacy as the government goes all out to attract more foreign investment for upgrade and transformation of the country's infrastructure? Can we expect development-focused diplomacy, a subject which Mr. Tirumurti will expound on further, to gain prominence in days to come? Bolstered by a robust parliamentary majority, can we expect the government to show more appetite for risk and display more muscular and strident posture vis-à-vis Pakistan and terrorism? All these are big questions. As of now, there are more questions than answers in this radically uncertain world as we look ahead to map out the foreign policy trajectory of India under the Modi 2.0 dispensation and its ramifications for the world at large. The last bit, given huge developmental challenges India is facing, diplomatic outreach will get intertwined more closely with the larger project of national renaissance. In the next 5 years, the government has set ambitious targets to ensure water supply for 150 million homes, to build over 125,000 kilometers of new roads, and to build 20 million houses for the poor by 2022. As Prime Minister Modi said in his speech at the UN General Assembly in New York last month, all our endeavors are centered on 1.3 billion Indians. But the dreams that these efforts are trying to fulfill are the same dreams that the entire world has, that every country has, and that every society has. The efforts are ours, but the fruits are all for the entire world. India's success will therefore not just be of the people of this country, but of the entire world. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, there is so much to say on a weighty subject like this, but I must not abuse the privilege of being a moderator and co-host to inflict a long, rambling speech on you. It's time for me to invite our guest of honor and distinguished speakers to unveil the special edition of India and World magazine and pose for a group photo. So can we unpack the magazine? Thank you. Now let me introduce our guest of honor, Shri T.S. Tirumurti, and other panelists. Mr. T.S. Tirumurti is Secretary Economic Relations in India's Ministry of External Affairs. In his current position, Mr. Tirumurti is in overall charge of India's relations with Africa, West Asia, and the Gulf. He is India's Sherpa for BRICS and IPSA. He also oversees all Indian development partnerships abroad. Mr. Tirumurti joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1985. Before assuming his current assignment as Secretary ER on February 5, 2018, he served as India's High Commissioner in Malaysia. His previous diplomatic assignments include postings in Cairo, Permanent Mission of India in Geneva, Washington, D.C., and Deputy Chief of Mission in Jakarta. He was India's first representative to Palestine. He has been Joint Secretary for 4 neighboring countries at headquarters in Delhi, as well as Joint Secretary for UN Economic and Social. He served as Director in Foreign Secretary's office. Juggling diplomacy and creative writing is not easy at the best of times, but Mr. Tirumurti is a man of many parts, and he has found time to pen a few novels as well. He has authored 3 books. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest of honor, Shri T.S. Tirumurti. Sir? Okay. Okay, all right. May I now invite Mr. Tirumurti to deliver his keynote address.
Shri Manish Chand, Founder, CEO, and Editor-in-Chief of India Rights Network, Dr. Ravikant Mishra of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, Excellencies, distinguished senior colleagues from the Indian Foreign Service, distinguished panelists, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a great privilege to be here this evening to speak on India's development diplomacy. Allow me to thank my friend, Shri Manish Chand, for this invite and for giving me an opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this topic. I would like to congratulate him on the unveiling of the special edition on India and the world, a valuable contribution to diplomacy for a new India. Let me at the outset remind this august group that even before the phrase development diplomacy was coined and became a conscious choice in our foreign policy, this impulse to share what we have with others has a strong civilizational underpinning. India has, through its history, prioritized cooperation over conflict, coexistence over competition, sharing over receiving, plurality over hegemony, and shared prosperity over zero-sum notions of growth. Developed diplomacy was therefore ingrained in our national habit and our civilizational identity. It was Swami Vivekananda who captured the essence of Indian diplomacy, and I quote, "Each nation must give in order to live. When you give life, you will have life. When you receive, you must pay for it by giving it to all others." Throughout history, India has always partaken with others our knowledge in science, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, music, the arts, indeed every aspect of human activity. Nearer our times, we shared the experience and the unique tools of our freedom struggle, which inspired many countries to throw away the yoke of colonialism. If you may, you could call it the freedom diplomacy. We have always thought beyond our borders. These days, we talk in terms of North-South cooperation and South-South cooperation. But given how, through history, countries used to flock to India to trade and, more importantly, to learn from us, we should probably have coined the term South-North cooperation as opposed to North-South cooperation. That's, of course, history, but certainly one which we can learn from as Indians. Therefore, when we now interact with fellow developing countries, a sense of kinship and solidarity binds us in forging development partnership. Many southern nations are linked to us now by our shared colonial experience as well as common post-colonial tasks of nation building and development. From freedom diplomacy, we have graduated to development diplomacy. Contemporaneously, the notion of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas and Sabka Vishwas is not just limited to our borders, but also informs our vision for the whole world. India's commitment to shared prosperity has guided our development assistance endeavors. India recognizes the mutually reinforcing and interdependent development paths that countries take are not taken just as a normative imperative, but as an enlightened choice. Just as India's development is good for the world as a factor for peace, prosperity, and stability, we believe that the development of other countries, including our neighbors, is also good for us. This is clearly visible in our choices and actions as we pursue cooperation with our partners. Friends, I can say without hesitation that our development partnership has evolved to become a complete and comprehensive framework touching upon the full spectrum of human endeavor. That's partly because it has grown organically over the decades, if not centuries. Because sometimes we tend to forget that India is not just a country, but a civilization. And this is true with our neighbors, or with the immediate extended neighborhood, or even with continents like Africa, where the Indian Ocean has been a bridge rather than a divide. I am fond of recalling an incident last year when the foreign minister of an African country, with whom we share very close ties, visited Delhi for a meeting with our external affairs minister. He made a phone call from the airport as soon as he arrived. On inquiry, we learned that he was calling his school teacher, who had taught him in his country and had since retired, returned, and settled down in Chennai. This is a bond which cannot be replicated. You cannot develop such bonds of brotherhood and friendship overnight. While the growth of our development diplomacy has been organic and hence remains deep and meaningful to this day, we have consciously taken steps to reinforce these links with new ties, new initiatives, new sectors of engagement, and new paradigms of cooperation. Take Team 9. This was a unique initiative to re-energize our relations with West Africa. During Prime Minister Vajpayee's time, we had constituted Team 9 with 8 West African countries and India to bring enhanced focus to our relations with West Africa. This was a very conscious effort, an effort which we are pursuing with renewed vigor. Now, several years later, we have subsumed our engagement with West Africa into our India-Africa Forum Summit by engaging with all African countries through our Development Partnership Network. After the new government took over a few months ago, the first visit of Honorable Rashtrapati Ji was to 3 West African countries, all of them for the first time. Honorable Vice President of India has just been to 2 African countries last week, both for the first time. In the last 5 years, our Rashtrapati Ji, Honorable Vice President and Prime Minister have made visits to 34 African countries. This intensity of high-level exchanges is unprecedented. This is illustrative of how organic developmental links are being reinforced by consciously imparting new energy, focus, and momentum. Our multifaceted bonds with Africa have been reinforced by the 10 guiding principles set out by Prime Minister in 2018. These guiding principles may well also be a template guiding India's development engagement with the rest of the developing world. Prime Minister's vision is for our development partnership to be guided by partners' priorities on terms that will be reasonable and comfortable for the partners, build local capacity, create local opportunities, and unleash the potential of the youth and their aspirations, liberate the potential of the country, open our markets, and make trade and investment easier, harness India's digital revolution to enhance education, health, public services, financial inclusion, etc., improve agriculture, address climate change, combat terrorism and extremism, keep oceans open and free, and strive together for a representative and democratic global order. It is therefore self-evident that any initiative that constrains the development space for a partner country cannot be part of development diplomacy. Any initiative that contributes to further indebtedness cannot be part of development diplomacy. And any initiative that seeks to impose conditionalities cannot come under the rubric of development diplomacy. Sustainability is the touchstone for development cooperation, and now we have the SDGs, which give us a useful reference framework to build on. The good news is that India has made purposeful strides in meeting its commitments made in the India-Africa Forum Summit 4 in 2015. Out of a commitment of 50,000 slots for capacity building over 5 years, we have done more than 40,000 already. And out of a grant commitment of US $600 million over 5 years, we have already exceeded the target in the first 3.5 years itself. And out of the lines of credit of US $10 billion, we have done nearly US $6.5 billion of our commitment. What is equally heartening is that our quality of implementation has been considerably enhanced along with the increasing pace of implementation. The reform in the guidelines we had brought about in 2015 under the IDEAS guidelines have ensured greater accountability, elimination of fly-by-night operators, allowing reputed companies to come in, and ensuring greater quality of work and delivery on the ground. Cleaning up of the system has been a priority, and we are ensuring this. Friends, our neighbors naturally remain our closest development partners. Ours are ties of blood, history, geography, resources, language, culture, etc. And in the last few years, I can say with certainty that our development partnership has come to occupy a central focus of our mutual engagement. It spans every aspect of human endeavor, ranging from big infrastructure projects to capacity building to high-impact community projects, etc. Neighborhood First is put into visible action by India. In the dam built in conflict-ridden Afghanistan that provides much-needed irrigation in Herat, in the temple restored in Tirukatishwaram to celebrate our shared cultural heritage in Sri Lanka, in the road built in Myanmar, or the rail links with Bangladesh and Nepal to enhance connectivity, and the hospitals established in nearly every South Asian country to better health services, in the South Asian satellite launched by ISRO for our neighbors that shares our space prowess, and in a whole spectrum of other areas, India's deep commitment to prosperity and stability in South Asia and the Indian Ocean is palpable. Even more importantly, the depth and resilience of our people-to-people links is continuously reinforced through some of our largest capacity-building programs anywhere in the world. To give you an example, over 2,500 training and scholarship slots are annually disbursed to Afghans alone. This is mirrored in similar initiatives with other neighbors like Nepal, Bhutan, and others. India has also has a significant horizontal development coverage in these countries through community-led development projects that are numerous, small-scale, and quick impact. Apart from our traditional forms of development assistance like lines of credit, grant assistance, high-impact community development, technical consultancy, capacity building, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, etc., we have consciously tried to venture into new sectors, improve delivery, innovate on existing services, bring into the fold new ways of doing things, and also leverage other forms of partnership. Friends, you are aware of our iTech program, which remains one of the most impactful capacity building programs since 1964. iTech has benefited 200,000 professionals over the last 55 years. Today, we offer around 12,000 scholarships annually to professionals from 160 partner countries in about 100 premier Indian institutions. We have strived to keep these training courses relevant and contemporary and demand-based. For example, we just had a group of 25 permanent secretaries from the Gambia, benefiting from the Indian model of good governance and administration. On 7th of October this year, we unveiled the iTech 2.0, if you may. The new initiatives include iTech Executive, which is aimed at senior officials and professionals, policymakers and technocrats at our apex public institutions like IITs and the IIMs. The iTech program, in partnership with IIT Madras for delivery through live online training, a new logo of iTech, as well as a revised iTech training calendar where we have courses in cutting-edge technology, as well as inclusion of a host of private training institutions as well. We also launched the tele-education and telemedicine program for all of Africa, E-Vidya Bharati, E-Arogya Bharati. Realizing the increasing aspirations of the youth in different countries, irrespective on where they are on their development journey, India has made development partnership a vehicle for sharing cutting-edge technology, especially digital technology and artificial intelligence. It is becoming increasingly evident that high-tech is a necessity for developing countries to leapfrog into the fourth industrial revolution. It is essential for impacting positively the lives of people, especially in delivery of public services, education, health, agriculture, etc. India, for example, is in the process of putting together a digital package for Africa, given the numerous initiatives undertaken by our government in the digital sphere. We have also established centers of IT excellence in Africa and elsewhere. Various stages of development coexist side by side within a country. But these countries should not lose out on the technological advances being made by others. For example, we have earmarked US dollars 1.6 billion as lines of credit for solar energy. And we are enhancing this package as demand comes in for our support from many countries. Most of the members of the International Solar Alliance, which is a brainchild of our Prime Minister, are African nations. India has also been able to rope in some of our best institutions to enhance our capacity building efforts. The E-Vidya Bharati, E-Arogya Bharati, tele-education and telemedicine initiative, for example, is backstopped by the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. Further, time and again, we have been informed that in a range of areas, India has the appropriate technological options and one which can be replicated at very low cost. Indian Development Partnership will ensure that the fourth industrial revolution is an inclusive one for our partner countries. An important area where we need to do more is to leverage trade and investment along with our development partnership efforts so that the engagement becomes sustainable and gets out of the development partnership cycle and becomes independent of it. This is important since resources of governments are finite. By bringing in private sector into the development fold, we can ensure that the benefits into area of economies of scale that Indian companies enjoy in India and our low-cost production can be passed on to consumers abroad. For example, our pharma products are now in great demand, especially in Africa. We are already doing PPP models and capacity building, and I don't see why we cannot replicate it elsewhere. In fact, the utilization of buyer's credit in Africa, as opposed to the softer lines of credit, in the last 5 years is nearly US dollars 1 billion. With Africa adopting the path-breaking Continental Free Trade Agreement, we need to ensure that development partnership and trade go together to have the best outcome and impact. We also believe that not enough attention is being given to youth and their aspirations in the construct of South-South cooperation. Empowering the youth and creating opportunities for employment need to go hand in hand. No one understands and appreciates this more than India as home to the largest youth population ever in human history. Therefore, we have welcomed students to come and study in India, and they come from all parts of the world. It can be seen in our liberal visa regime for students. The Ministry of Human Resource Development's program, Study in India, which was launched last year, supplements this effort and offers foreign students of all backgrounds. Study in India is a network of around 800 universities and 3,800 colleges. And we have been using this outreach with sensitivity. For example, to assist Syria, which is trying to emerge out of sustained conflict. We have readily admitted 400 Syrian students under our Study in India program into our premier institutions of higher education with full scholarship. Triangular cooperation is yet another innovation which is being pursued, though it is still at a nascent stage. Triangular cooperation attempts to combine the best of North and South for the benefit of the South. India is working with countries like Japan, France, EU, the US, as well as multilaterally through IPSA and the United Nations to see how best Africa and Asia can benefit from this tripartite construct. Friends, while I have tried to expansively cover the breadth of India's development diplomacy, in concluding, I want to leave you with this thought. Our development diplomacy is more than the sum of its parts. It goes much beyond the US dollars 29 billion or so we have committed under lines of credit. It goes much beyond the 200,000 we have trained under ITEC. It goes much beyond the 160 countries who have benefited from it. It also goes beyond the crores in grant assistance to build dams, enhance connectivity, change lives of the people in our partner countries, provide humanitarian aid of food and medicines, etc. Our development diplomacy is a sum of all this and more. As Swami Vivekananda said, and I'm sorry I'm quoting him again because I come from the Ramakrishna Mission schools, with every man there is an idea. The external man is only the outward manifestation, the mere language of this idea within. Likewise, every nation has a corresponding national idea. This idea is working for the world and is necessary for its preservation. For India, the national idea is development partnership. The vehicle is development diplomacy. The goal is striving collectively for shared peace, prosperity, and development. Ladies and gentlemen, let me thank Sri Manish Chand and the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Tirumurti, for this very splendid, overarching, magisterial view of India's development diplomacy, and also emphasizing that, about the linkage between the external and the internal, that where does this development diplomacy comes from, that is from our deep-rooted spiritual traditions of giving, of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and the idea of the whole world as one. I would now like to open the panel discussion on diplomacy for a new India. And just to outline some rules that I'm going to invite each speaker, they are to strictly stick to maybe 7-8 minutes, not more than that, so that at the end of the day we have some time for discussion. Also, let me emphasize that we have a truly outstanding panel. None of them need any introduction before this well-informed and discerning audience, but a brief resume is in order before I invite each of them to speak. We have with us three former diplomats from India, each a stalwart in his own right. Ambassador Kanwal Sibal is a former foreign secretary and served as India's ambassador to Russia and France, among other countries. He is now a prolific writer and commentator and is often seen on primetime TV news channels. Besides being a diplomat, not many know that Ambassador Sibal is also a fine poet. His Snowflakes of Time, a collection of his poems, brings out very vividly that we probably need more poetry in our diplomatic engagements. Ambassador Anil Wadhwa served as Secretary East in Ministry of External Affairs, and under his charge steered India's East policy to new heights. As an ambassador to India, his stints encompassed east to west as he raised the bar for India's relations with Thailand, Oman, Italy, and Poland. Ambassador Anil Trigunayat served as India's ambassador to Jordan, Libya, and Malta. He is currently President, Millennial India International Chamber of Commerce, Industry and Agriculture, and Distinguished Fellow, Vivekanand International Foundation. In his various roles, Ambassador Trigunayat has shown great enthusiasm for advancing India's diplomatic footprints. Algeria's ambassador to India, His Excellency Hamza Yahya Sharif, he has been in Delhi since 2014, an eventful period that saw a new momentum in India-Algeria relations. Before assuming charge as Algeria's ambassador to India, His Excellency Hamza Sharif was in charge of studies and synthesis at the cabinet of His Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. In his distinguished diplomatic career, he served as Algeria's ambassador to Indonesia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam. Ambassador of Brazil, Andre Arana Correa do Lago, is currently Brazil's ambassador to India. He was Brazil's chief negotiator for climate change and for Rio Plus 20 conference held in 2012. He has been appointed as a juror to architecture's most prestigious prize, the Pritzker Architecture Prize. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have a powerhouse of talent, expertise in this panel. And of course, it would be remiss if I do not introduce Mr. Remen Babuskin, who joined in Deputy Chief of Mission, Embassy of the Russian Federation to India. He is he's a powerful believer in a brighter future for India-Russia relations, and we are privileged. We are really lucky to have him join in as a speaker and on a very short notice. So now I invite Ambassador Kanwal Sibal to speak on India's relations with major powers. And Mr. Sibal, you may like to highlight that, what does it involve that, at a time when the world is witnessing a major trade war between two of the world's biggest economies, how do you see India's relation major powers shaping up? Over to Mr. Sibal. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to this discussion this evening. You've given me 7, 8, 9 minutes, but you want me to talk about the big picture of India's relations with major powers and priorities of Modi 2.0 foreign policy. So let me see if I can compress all my thoughts in 8, 9 minutes. First of all, priorities don't change in a country's foreign policy so quickly because they are determined by factors which are quasi-permanent, whether it's geography or demography or neighbors or the regional challenges, or for that matter, even the basic trends in international relations and governance, which are slow to change. So since they remain virtually the same, so the options in terms of major redirection of foreign policy are limited. Therefore, I don't believe in this 2.0 foreign policy of Modi. It will be a continuation of the previous 5 years of our policy, which itself is rooted in India's foreign policy virtually since our independence. But since there is a constant churn in international relations, So policymakers have to be nimble and adjust to these changing circumstances in order to maximize national interest. But if one were to quickly underline in a bullet form what would be the basic principles of our foreign policy under Prime Minister Modi's next 5 years, I would say that he would continue to focus on increasing India's role in the world. We've heard in the past that he visualizes India as a leading power in the world, not a leading power in the sense as the traditional big powers, but in terms of being able to play a role which is commensurate with India's demography, its geographic size, its economic potential, its human potential, and its civilizational contributions to the world. Number two, whether we can always do that or not, because we have to live in the real world, but we want to be a positive force in an increasingly difficult international environment, which means that we must maintain friendly relations with all countries. Earlier, there was a reference made to multi-alignment, which merely means that we are not going to be aligned with one single country or one single bloc, but will look for friendships and win-win situations with all our major partners. In other words, we will look for convergences as much as we can. We also are facing a situation where multilateralism is being challenged, which means, therefore, the established international system, with all its flaws, of course, is being stressed even more at a time when the world has shrunk because of globalization and interdependence. We see the opposite trend of countries relying on unilateralism and my country first, and therefore, in a sense, contributing to the breakdown of the existing international system. India doesn't want a breakdown of the international system as it exists, but wants to reform it, and that effort will continue. We are facing challenges of globalization, anti-globalization trends and protectionist trends. The WTO is being weakened, and all this impinges on our interests at a moment when our graph, economic graph and development graph is rising. I think Prime Minister has shown a lot of wisdom in taking the lead on some of the issues which are of deep concern to the international community, like climate change. A few years ago, India was seen to be recalcitrant, being a problem in international discussions on climate change, but now it's just the reverse, where in terms of his International Solar Alliance initiative, along with the French president, his focus on environmental issues, and the targets he has set for ourselves on renewable energy issues. I had thought that 175 gigawatts of renewable energy was a very tall and ambitious objective, but already we have reached 122, and now he has raised that figure to 450 gigawatts of renewable energy. There was a reference made earlier about India's civilizational heritage. Now, that heritage includes very close ties to our East in particular, and this is something which the new government under Modi has been doing, which was not done sufficiently in the past, that to leverage these traditional civilizational ties in terms of advancing mutual partnerships. I think what he has in mind, as I understand, is to look very carefully at India's strengths, identify what India's strengths are, and see how they can be of service to ourselves, of course, as members of the international community, but to the international community at large. He's opening up the Indian economy, as we know. along with the ease of doing business. He is very much focused on ease of living. In terms of opening of the Indian economy, certainly he has in mind that India should progressively become a hub for exports to the part of the world which is actually currently the most productive and the most, progressive in terms of business to our east. Then, as part of this, I think recognizing the shifts of political and economic power towards the east, naturally we will continue to deepen India's relations with ASEAN and give it even greater force to our Act East policy. Certainly, as part of our effort to play a larger role on the international scene, I think the government is determined, it will not be easy, but determined to strengthen India's defense capabilities with a focus on Make in India. And for this to develop partnerships with those countries which can provide us the technology to build our Make in India in the defense area. I think it's very important for a country like India to maintain a balance in our foreign policy and to preserve our strategic autonomy. Many people confuse strategic autonomy with some kind of a reversion to non-aligned thinking, but this is not true. It simply just means that we are not going to be constrained in our choices as much as possible by actually having to accommodate the interests of others which clash with ours. So when the strategic interests of India are not in alignment with the strategic interests of our partners, then we should be able to have that freedom of choice to do what is necessary for our interests. I think the government is aware that India's economic rise is expanding its foreign policy options, which means that India doesn't have to choose sides in a multipolar world, but position itself in such a manner that partnership with India is valued by other power centers. Combating terrorism certainly is very on top of the agenda of the Prime Minister. He has floated the idea of a global conference on international terrorism. It hasn't yet picked up. Even our sponsorship of a comprehensive convention on international terrorism in the UN has not progressed. In short, what the Prime Minister Modi's policy would be a non-ideological foreign policy, which is pragmatic but not unprincipled. Basically, the basic principles of international law, non-interference in the internal affairs of others, respect for sovereignty, our opposition to unilateralism, regime change, our support for multilateralism, our support for UN, all these things would be there. Now, coming now to the next part of what I was asked to speak about is our relations with the big powers. Now, it is quite clear that the United States has become by far India's most important partner. The scope and depth of our relations with the United States are not matched by any other relationship we have. This has nothing to do with any lack of desire to actually expand our relationship with other traditional partners as much as we can. But the reality on the ground is that in terms of meeting India's need, the country that is in a position to fulfill these needs in a comprehensive way across sectors is the United States of America. It's our biggest trade partner, if you include services, in terms of investment, in terms of technology. Even our defense relationship is growing. We have now strategic understandings with the United States with regard to the Indo-Pacific region. Our trade has climbed to $142 billion from about $20 billion at the beginning of this century. Even the defense relationship has grown to about $18 billion. The people ties are the most, expansive that we have with any other country. Any other country, if you look at the Indian diaspora, and the number of Indian students in the United States, 200,000, et cetera, et cetera. We're also now developing energy ties with the United States, but the fact that the United States is now our most important partner doesn't necessarily mean that it is the easiest partner for us to deal with. In fact, there are challenges in dealing with the United States, and under President Trump, even more so, because he's very mercurial and very erratic. So the task of India would be to get close to the United States as much as possible, but not so much as to lose our options. I think Europe is a very good example of countries that are allies of the United States, but we can see how they are unable to exercise options because of this dependence and relationship. So we will see convergence, as our foreign minister said very wisely, we'll see convergence with the United States, but not congruence in a multipolar world. Now, that brings me to China. We have to engage China at the highest level because there are very major issues in our relationship. We are aware of China's hegemonic ambitions in Asia and beyond. It poses a challenge not only to us, but increasingly to others on land and sea. Its relationship with Pakistan is a big problem for us. It has taken positions on the Kashmir issue, which naturally India resents. Nevertheless, since it is the second largest economy in the world and in a sense the second most important country in the world in overall terms, and it is sitting right on our border in the north, and we have serious issues with them, we have to engage China. Everybody has to engage China, and that explains the Wuhan spirit and the Chennai Connect. The idea, of course, is to be able to manage our difficult relationship with China and control tensions and not allow differences to become disputes, as our Prime Minister says. China, of course, wants to maintain political and security pressure on us, but at the same time seek openings in the Indian market. So our challenge is how we can benefit from China's investment and trade ties, but also balance it with security considerations, which therefore means that on issues like Huawei and 5G and the Belt and Road Initiative, we'll continue to have reservations. Russia, our longest standing relationship of trust is with Russia. Russia remains our key defense partner. We are expanding our energy ties with Russia. Unfortunately, the economic ties with Russia have not expanded. With $10 billion, $12 billion, $11 billion of trade, it is insufficient. Though I must say that on the energy side, we are making good progress, and that will give a second pillar to our relationship in addition to defense. Russia may not be as vital to our overall interests as in the past, especially during the Cold War era, but the investment that both countries have made in the bilateral relationship for the last 65, 70 years is so important that neither side would wish that to be diluted in any way. And there is a very strong policy consensus in favor of a very strong political understanding with Russia, which is why on issues like S-400, we have taken a very firm decision, notwithstanding the U.S. pressure, that when it comes to our interests, national interests in relationship with Russia, we'll follow what is best for us. And finally, as part of our, as I mentioned, of having a multi-vectored foreign policy, which gives a certain balance to it, we are members of the RIC dialogue, of BRICS, of SCO. This is part of our balancing strategy. Now, I can't talk about Europe as a power because Europe is not a power. Individual European countries are power, are big powers certainly. So I will not be able to talk about our relationship with Europe, because that would mean a relationship with Brussels, which is essentially economic. But with individual countries, especially with France and Germany, France in terms of security, space, defense, etc., we have very, very good understandings. And of course, Germany is our biggest economic partner in Europe. With France, we have a joint vision for the Indian Ocean region. We are cooperating very closely on the issue of terrorism and on climate change. So this is the overall picture with regard to our relations with major powers and the priorities of both the 2O foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Sibal, for that very insightful talk on this very delicate balancing which India has to do and it juggles its relations with major powers. You have, in your presentation has several ideas which deserve greater amplification, and we'll come to that in the Q&A session. Now I invite His Excellency Ambassador of Brazil to India to speak on a role of BRICS in shaping the global agenda in view of the forthcoming summit in Brazil and India-Latin America relations.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to be here today and to have been invited for this discussion. I'm going to be well behaved in 7 minutes. I will here check that. But very quickly, I want to put some elements that may be a little provocation also. But so I'm going to start a bit on the future trajectory of India, Latin America, and India-Brazil relations. And I want to start saying that we are really very distant. And this is a very sad thing, because we have fantastic cooperation in multilateral dimension, but Latin America and India needs to be, this relation has to be stimulated. And I want to say that the good news is that we feel very much on the side of India a desire to strengthen this relation with Latin America and the Caribbean. And why is this, I think, very necessary? I think that there are just two numbers that we need to give to the Indians on the Latin American Caribbean. One is that although the whole region has less than half of your population, we are mere 650 million people, but the GDP is 5.6 trillion. So this is a very, very impressive number. We have considerably high GDP per capita in many countries of Latin America. And although when you read the papers, and I obviously do this exercise here to see what comes from Latin America in the papers here in India, and normally it's only the bad news that come from Latin America. But there are extremely positive things that have happened in stabilization and in the way that the countries have found individual solutions inside a certain logic that I believe we can still talk about Latin America and the Caribbean. So I believe that the numbers I gave is enough to show how can we be so separated when we know we need each other. Regarding India and Brazil, I think it's much better than as the whole region. We have a very, very strong relation in multilateral, as well economic as political and climate change, etc. By the way, Tirumurti and I were wonderful colleagues and very close in climate change negotiations. But I want to mention that we have in common the fact that we think that the international system, both Bretton Woods and UN, was not designed in our favor. And we have been working inside these institutions in a very constructive way, but we have also tried to change these institutions. And that's why we have strengthened so much our efforts on BRICS, which is first directed to the economic and trade dimensions, the economic imbalances and the lack of attention to the importance that the countries of BRICS should have in the international discussions, but also in the G4 that we are very close in regarding our efforts regarding the Security Council. But we cannot forget also IPSA that symbolizes South-South cooperation, I believe, at its best, and many other circumstances in which we've been working together, adapting according to the main theme, be it basic in climate change or others. But so we are very conscious that we have become big enough to have to be taken into consideration, but we also know that there are some limits to what we can do. But our commitment is with our people, and we cannot explain to our people that we are not going to go until the end in our effort to not only adapt to the system, but also to try to change the system. And in a bilateral relation, I think that we have really made significant advances. And as you know, Prime Minister Modi is going to Brazil for the BRICS summit and was invited also for a bilateral. And we have prepared for this bilateral more than 10 agreements that we will sign. And one of them, I think, is highly symbolic, is the Agreement for Cooperation Facilitation on Investment, an ACFI, which will be the first ACFI that India signs with the country after India changed the model of it, and as the first was negotiated and signed. And the Indian investments in Brazil are very good news. For you to have an idea, India is investing 6 times more in Brazil than Brazil in India. And we are very, very happy with that. We're not happy that we are not investing more in India, but supposedly my job is to try to work on that. I'm trying. But the fact is that there is a discovery of each other. But the truth is that both India for Brazil and Brazil for India are not in the mainstream of the center of the first things that you're discussing in a meeting, because we all have complex regions, we all have other priorities, and most of all, we both like each other. So we're not a worry. We're not worried about India. India is not worried about Brazil. So somehow we are victims of our friendship. But we have to do more because it's a very, very natural relationship. And I think you were a very good expression that you used here was that we are convinced that development of others is good for us. We are also very much convinced of that. In that context, Mercosur in Latin America has made extraordinary advances, although, again, you only see news about the Mercosur when there is a problem. But we just signed probably the most important free trade agreement in recent years with the European Union, which I think will have a very strong impact. Finally, on BRICS, very quickly, some people think that we lose steam. We're not losing steam. For you to have an idea, we had 93 government meetings. We're having in the total 17 ministerial meetings. We have 19 people-to-people meeting. And obviously, we're going to have the summit in Brasilia in November. And the BRICS continues to make complete sense. But it's true that the BRICS has a bit gone into different directions than were originally thought of. And so I would like to mention the priorities that Brazil sees in this BRICS year, which are not so obvious, because what happens in the BRICS is that we are very different. I'm very happy to have here Roman with us. We have very different economies, the countries of the BRICS. And we got together because we have some things that we have very strongly in common. And we have discovered that we have more things in common. So I think that the priorities of Brazil this year was to concentrate on things that really the five can be very close together. So the science, technology, innovation, digital economy is something that Brazil has been pushing very hard. Also, the business council that we have to get more investment, to get more results, and naturally the strengthening of the new development bank, the BRICS Bank, as it is called, and which is not only symbolic, but is also an extraordinary alternative for our countries to invest in each other's country. Then, transnational illicits, organized crime, terrorism, all these issues have become very central in this year that we have been discussing together. And finally, technical cooperation, but also very much energy and health. So this is a very positive agenda. This is an agenda in which we are absolutely convinced that we have to have these elements as main priorities. I would like just to finish by mentioning something that I think it was the first speech of the new foreign minister, and he mentioned something that I thought was extremely useful and constructive and important, is that India will act in its foreign policy already conscious that it's going to be the third economy in the world by 2030. You cannot act as the country of today because everything in foreign policy takes many years. It's not the diplomat's fault, but normally people say it is. And this is a very, very important statement. And in that context, I would like to remember that Brazil, which is now the 8th economy, has been surpassed by India 3 years ago. But Brazil will be, by 2030, will be either between 6th and 8th economy. So we will anyway be absolutely central economies in the years to come. So I think that if we look at Brazil and India, the potential that we have today, we know the more we learn about what already exists, so we already have a very strong relation, political and economic, but the potential is not only very important, as we say many times about many countries, but the fact is that both our countries are going to continue to be extremely important for the next decades. And it makes complete sense that we mainstream this relationship in all dimensions as much as we can. And I will try hard on my side to do that. And I count so many friends here in India to continue that. Thank you very much. Yes, a donation.
Excellency, thank you for this very eloquent and engaging presentation, and I'm glad you stuck to the time limit. The idea that Brazil and India and Latin America are out there, of course, geographically we may be distant, but there's a lot more that we can do together, and I'm glad you brought that out very vividly. We now move on to Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, who will speak to us about importance of Act-East policy, ASEAN for India's rise, and the new buzzword in geopolitical lexicon, the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, Manish. It's a pleasure to be here at this event. And I'm glad that I have less amount of themes to talk about because it makes it easier to stick to your time limit. So I'll try and do that. I think, the first theme that I would pick up amongst these is the issue of Indo-Pacific and how that is changing and affecting India's Act-East policy. In fact, the Act-East policy itself has expanded itself in scope and in dimension over the past few years. So first of all, the Indo-Pacific. As we know, the concept means different things to different countries. For India, it's a very large geography, so it extends all the way from the coast of Africa into the Pacific. But for others, it may not mean the same thing. So therefore, we have to concentrate on where India should lay its emphasis on. And frankly, over the years, what has happened with our focus is that we are now looking more and more in our immediate vicinity, which is the Indian Ocean. In the Indian vicinity in the immediate vicinity of the Indian Ocean that India focuses on, obviously the area of to our south, and also to the Bay of Bengal, the entry into the Bay of Bengal through Malacca Straits. All these become important for India as we go along. And why has Indo-Pacific become important is because today in this region we have powers which have become contending powers, which was not the case a few years ago. Primarily there is the factor of the rise of China, and therefore there is also a dimension which has been brought about as far as the dynamics with ASEAN and other countries of the region are concerned. Now, what Indian foreign policy will need to cope with in the future, of course, is a focus on its defense dimension to make sure that India's interests, which are primarily related to energy and trade, are protected. And that's why India has been emphasizing in the past and will continue to do so that the Indo-Pacific should remain a free and open Indo-Pacific, that there should also be a region which will play by the rules of the road, and that there should be no extraneous influences which would actually impede progress of countries who are in this region. The Act East policy of India will also become obviously multidimensional. How will it become multidimensional? There is, first of all, the focus in ASEAN, which has always been there. Why has the focus on ASEAN been there? Because it started off with connectivity, which was the most important theme in our Act East policy, so that the northeast of India opens up to the outside world and develops. It is also to make sure that India's trade and investments benefit from this relationship with ASEAN and countries to our east. And gradually this has been expanded now to the Pacific Island states as well, as we all know. It's not just Pacific Island states, and it goes beyond that to Australasia, to the relationship with Korea, the relationship with Japan, and at the same time it is assumed a dimension which was unforeseen in the past, which is that there is now an engagement in the military dimension, the naval dimension, with countries in ASEAN and the countries of the region as well. The third dimension of Act East policy, of this comprehensiveness of the Act East policy, which will play out in the future, is going to be the dimension of the Quad, which is also something which has come about as a result of the different dynamics in the region and how India will play out in this process. Now, as far as the Quad is concerned, India has already given it a dimension which is a development dimension. So we talk about connectivity with maritime security, and we talk about an alternative to funding which is available in the region through the Quad countries. And that is how the Quad is progressing at the moment. I foresee that this will continue to do so in the future. If you look at alternate funding for connectivity in the region, if we take the Pacific region first, we see that India has recently announced a fund for developing projects in the Pacific, which are targeted specifically at each Pacific Island state. And this has been also announced by countries like Australia. There's been enhancement in the funding which is available in the region through the Build and the Area Acts of United States. There's been funding which is made available now, extensive funding by Japan for countries of the Southeast Asia and the Pacific as well. Putting all these together, we have a picture where there is an alternate funding which is available to the Chinese funding, which is the BRI, and therefore nothing could be better than a cooperative approach to this development, which will eventually benefit ASEAN. And that's what India has made clear, that it is the Indo-Pacific is not something which is directed against any other country, but at the same time it is a concept where we'd like to see an open and free Indo-Pacific, which would be of benefit for the development of the countries of the region. Moving on from there, the third theme that you asked me to talk about, Manish, was about an assessment of the summit meeting which India and China had recently at Mamallapuram. I think it was a much awaited summit after Wuhan, which happened last year. As we went into the summit, of course the expectations were not very high. This was quite obvious because there were seemingly a lot of divergences that both countries had, which had emerged due to circumstances around us, and most recently also the reorganization of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, in Article 370 abrogation in particular, in which, as was already mentioned, there was a stand taken by China as far as Pakistan is concerned in its support, and that sort of did affect the atmosphere which was leading up to Mamallapuram. There was also mounting trade deficit issue, the long-standing issue of unsettled border between the two countries, and obviously when a summit level meeting takes place, these are issues which obviously loom large over, and expectations are very high that something would be done to mitigate that difference between these two countries. Now, as it turns out, I think what the summit wanted to achieve, in a sense, in my view, has been achieved, because it actually brought about a certain amount of balance in the thinking once again. It brought about a situation where both sides could freely express themselves, and although we don't see anything on paper as by way of agreements, I think what will happen in future, and this process will continue in future, so we will continue to have a situation where we will air these differences, try to find solutions and a balance, and as somebody mentioned before me, that we will not allow our differences to become disputes. And that's the whole aim of this process. China is an important neighboring country of India, and therefore we will have to engage China, and China will have to engage India as well, because India also has its own value and its play in today's circumstances in this world. And the final dimension of this is the recognition that the trade deficit is something which will have to be addressed in some way or the other. So the establishment of a high-level mechanism which resulted from this summit is something which will address this issue. How far it will succeed, we don't know, but at least it will lead to a situation where there is dialogue and where there's an airing of views on this issue. Also, in my opinion, I think the time is ripe that India and China look at an early harvest of what can be achieved by way of settlement of the border issue. Because it's not as if the entire border is complicated. There are areas along the way. We've agreed on certain measures in the past, and there is actually a need to make sure that the working groups which have been set up before do their job and they meet regularly. The last issue that I would like to touch upon is the question of RCEP, and I think you said that I should bring that in as an important development which is about to take place. As far as RCEP is concerned, it poses a lot of challenges, as we all know, to India. At least 8 major industries have expressed reservations. The reservations stem from the fact that India does not have a free trade agreement with China, with Australia, and with New Zealand. And obviously, there is apprehension that the Indian market would be flooded with cheap goods if tariff lines are reduced beyond a certain point without any safeguards. And that is why today we have a situation in the negotiations that there are, out of the 20 chapters, we have 14 of them agreed, but at least 6 of them are not agreed, primarily because India has reservations and its own viewpoint, in my view, rightly so. And I think these will have to be addressed before India can actually become part of this very important agreement, which actually will cover a major portion of the world's economy, and it will also cover a lot of important countries in the region, because it's all 10 ASEAN states and plus 6 other major players in Asia. So in terms of what remains, in my opinion, the most important issue today would be the rules of origin issue, because obviously this issue has not been addressed in the past. We've seen how the previous FTAs that India has signed with other countries have been violated, and at the same time there's been no remedy which has been taken on time, because that provision of this agreement had not been was not strong enough to take measures in time. And therefore India is insisting that there should be a strengthening of this provision. There is also the late issue of e-commerce, which as we all know, Indian government's policy has been to localize the data as much as possible in India. And if the agreement talks about, an ASEAN proposal talks about making sure that no country can object to electronic data being shared with the other countries, that obviously creates problems as far as India is concerned. There are a few other issues in investment, but those have all been on the table for a while. The greatest safeguard that can be built into this agreement, as far as India is concerned, is to have a trigger mechanism which switches on when there's a surge of excessive exports to India in a particular commodity, and that would be, in my view, the best way to safeguard the industrial concerns which will invariably come up in future if we are not careful with that. So agreement hangs in balance, in my view, and it will take some doing for India to actually achieve what it wants, so that it can happily be a part of this very important agreement. I'll end there. Thank you.
Mr. Wadhwa, thanks for touching upon diverse but interrelated themes, and also underscoring very vividly that the Indo-Pacific is not against something, but it is for something. Now I invite Algeria's ambassador to India, His Excellency Hamza Yahya Sharif, to speak on Algeria-India relations and how he sees, from his part of the world, India's rise as an important regional and global player.
Assalamu alaikum, namaskar. Peace be on all of you. I would like first to start by thanking the organizers for giving me this opportunity and giving me the privilege to be part of these very highly knowledgeable panels. Dr. Ravi Mishra, Shri Manish Chand, His Excellency Shri T.S. Tirumurti, Ambassador Sibal, Ambassador Correa Dolago, Ambassador Wadhwa, Ambassador Trigunayat, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. My speech is short, as the short notice I have been asked to do. It will take only 2 points. It's past and present. In the past, where we as Algerians and as North African, where we discovered India, we discovered it in multilateralism. Let me share with you this point which I got when I used to be ambassador of Algeria in Indonesia. I met Rozihan Anwar, who used to be a writer, journalist, author, and very critical of Sukarno, and by being his very close friend. He refused to be minister for so many times with Sukarno. he told me how come the non-alignment, where we discovered India, came in the history. He told me that Sukarno was just observing Nehru by doing two things. He adopted democracy as political scene and socialism as economy. Then Sukarno called Nehru ji, telling him, how come? I mean, when you adopt democracy, we are expecting liberalism, and how come? He said, yes, I was obliged to do that because we were in the Cold War. It is called Cold War. And by adopting democracy, I wanted to avoid the coup and to be, really seriously beaten by the White House. And by adopting socialism, I want to be a friend with Moscow and communism and socialism that time. Then Sukarno said to Nehru, why are you so selfish? Why not get this idea to Africa and Asia and let's do something? And there is a lot of people now fighting for their independence. Why not organize something? And then Nehru said, yes, because the idea is coming from you, organize it in Indonesia and we will invite people. So from that, they did Bandung Conference. And in Bandung Conference, the leaders of Istiqlal, of Dastur, Istiqlal is Morocco, Dastur is Tunisia, and FLN, Liberation National Front, went there, and of course, Egypt with Jamal Abdel Nasser, and they attended the Bandung Conference, which was organized by Indonesia and Sukarno, but the real engine of that conference was India through Jawaharlal Nehru. And from that conference, the Algerian delegation went to New York and registered its case for the independence of Algeria. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs, I think it was Pini at that time, he walked out. It was the first time that a liberation movement pushed a Minister of Foreign Affairs of one of the 5 permanent members walking out of the Security Council. This is the past. Now let's go to the present. President Bouteflika was invited as the chief guest in 2001 as the first ever Arab leader to get this privilege. Of course, among some of our Arab brothers, they got jealous, and they have been invited after that. And the first African leader was Julius Nyerere, if I am not wrong. The first Arab was my head of state. That's why when the President Bouteflika in 2005, March, organized a summit of the Arab League, he invited India as observer. He almost shocked his brothers, the Arab leaders, and say, how come I am going to organize an Arab League summit in Algeria and I will not invite India? This is a shame for me. So India will come as observer. And in that summit he said that we are hearing and listening about, they call it reform of Security Council of things and so on. He said, if only one seat will be added to the permanent, this seat should go to India. This is the present. Now, let's see, now talking about present and bureaucracy, of course. I'm not blaming India, I'm not blaming Algeria or other North African countries, but it's something which we inherited. And it's a value which we are sharing. We share good values like fighting colonialism, and we share some bad habits like bureaucracy. So now I am going to talk about Algeria, India, and North Africa, India. So visits are there. The previous Vice President visited Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. Egyptian President visited India twice. A lot of ministers exchange of visit. Joint commission are running. If you come to the trade volume, it's almost 3 billion between Algeria and India, almost 2 billion between Morocco and India, little more than $500 million between Tunisia and India. The largest is Egypt due to so many reasons. It's a couple of billions. Now I'm talking about the present perception. For us as Algerians, and I think, and Mr. Hassan Alawi, the DCM of Morocco, is here as the only one North African with me this evening. The perception is two symbol animals here in India. It's the elephant and the peacock. So for us, and I think is the same feeling in Morocco, India is a giant and beautiful. So let's take advantage of that, both. The advantage of the strength and the advantage of beautifulness. So, in this perception, distance doesn't matter. I personally, I feel that, and I think also my brothers and colleagues in North Africa. If I go from Algiers to Marseille, which is southern Europe, southern France, it takes me roughly 50 minutes. Before landing, I feel already myself foreigner, even before landing. Then I travel, and I think also it's the case of my colleagues here. I travel 1,000 kilometers. I reach Delhi, Mumbai, even Srinagar, which I have been last year. I never felt myself foreigner here. So, when I reached Delhi in 2015, after presenting my credentials, I went and met Her Excellency Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman, used to be Minister of Trade and Industry. I just knocked at the door and said, Excellency, you maybe are expecting to meet an ambassador, but it's wrong. You are going to meet an Algerian, which is very friendly to India. How come Algeria and India would not see their joint commission not meeting for a gap of 13 years? So you can call police, you can call your security people. I'm not going to leave your office until you give me a date to have a joint commission. She was laughing, and I was laughing too. Unfortunately, 2 days after, she gave me a date, and we had our joint commission, the 5th, I think, after a gap of 13 years. I mean, this is the way to talk to India. Don't be diplomat. Just don't speak English, don't speak Hindi, don't speak Telugu, don't speak Kannada. Speak the language of the heart, and all doors will be open. So, coming to the perception, as Algerian and as North African. Now I am even part Indian after my 3rd time to India. God or nature, I don't know, maybe both, put the challenges of India as in terms of energy and fertilizers. And we, as North African, we are provider of energy and fertilizers. India got technology, know-how in buildings, healthcare, whatever. And we are in lack of that. We need that. So let's cross the challenge and the solution in both and build bridge in that sense that your challenge, you got the solution in our area. Our challenge, we can get solution in yours. Let's breathe that. Now, India is rising. It might astonish people who really do not know India, but we know India because we discover it not in bilateral, because bilateral is very selfish. Very, very selfish. We did discover India in multilateralism, where we try to protect the interest of entire society. So, by history, we have been colonized more than 132 years in Algeria and almost the same in Morocco, Tunisia. Now, for Europeans, we got oil. Morocco got phosphate, Tunisia little phosphate and little olive oil. It's easy. Sale, give us your money and we will give you technology. But don't invest, don't produce. And they even created somehow and protected the terrorism. Because when we have terrorism in our side, we cannot invest. If we cannot invest, we cannot produce. And if we cannot produce, we have to buy because we have oil. The question is there. Is India, because we discovered India, fighting colonialism? Is India ready now to help us and to be competitor of the colonialism in Europe economic challenges? To give you a very small example. This glass, I bought it here for really few rupees. The same, they will sell it to me in France for 100 rupees. It's very easy. You can put it even in your mobile phone. This is India. So, just to give you an example, what is colonialism? I was here in India and going to Algeria through Paris. This was long time. It was in 89. And the police immigration, when I handed over the passport, and that time there was no visa system. He asked me, how long are you going or are you planning to stay in France? I said, oh, for sure, I can tell you. I will stay less than 132 years. So, I don't know whether it's a diplomatic speech or not, but from the beginning I said to His Excellency, my dear brother Tirumurti, that I'm not going to talk as a diplomat but as a student, because the students are always learning. So, now let me say also something serious. We have opposite challenges, but we have one common challenge, which is terrorism. And my government, my people, street people, are very, very recognizing the efforts done by His Excellency Modi ji in his speech with terrorism. Because with terrorism, you cannot talk about health, you cannot talk about education, We lost 9 years fighting terrorism, 3 lakhs people, billions. To whom interest? You can guess. I was talking about, you can guess. So now I would like to conclude with this, that is India ready? Because the phenomenon of democracy is now touching our area. I would like to congratulate Tunisians for electing their president, a professor of university in the constitutional law. In Algeria, we are for 7-8 months now marching in the street. We stop the president for his 5th term. We put 2 prime ministers in jail, 15 ministers in jail, 2 very high-ranking generals sentenced. This is democracy. This is the time the changing. I really ask India that now it's time, because our people decided to divorce with the colonialism. Now I would like to finish with this, which has nothing to do with India and North Africa and India and Algeria. It's between China and India. I was here in 1989, first secretary, and President Gorbachev paid his state visit. Rajiv Gandhi was prime minister. I have been told, and this is the tricks between Algeria and India. I was just first secretary, but I used to have some doors to have some news in the PMO, Prime Minister Office. And somebody very close to Rajiv told me that Gorbachev told him, Rajiv, I don't understand you. You got very good relations with Cuba. You got very good relations with New Zealand, and you have very bad relations with China. No, you should go there. Don't talk politics. Talk culture, talk trade, or talk exchange of families. No. And this will create a good ambience, a good environment to talk between China and India. Because two giants, one dragon and tiger fight, it's the entire of the forest which will pay. Thank you. I hope, was it in my time?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Excellency, for this heart-to-heart talk. Very engaging. You lightened up the atmosphere, and with your anecdotes, you brought out the heart-to-heart emotional bonding between our two countries. Now I invite Ambassador Trigu Nayak to speak on India's relations with Africa and the Gulf region.
Good evening. Thank you, Manish. My task is much more easier since Ambassador Tirumurti already laid out our outreach with Africa, and Ambassador Sharif has spoken about North Africa. A few points I will talk about Africa and then move on a little bit to the West Asia. In Africa, actually, it's not a unitary. It's a combination of almost 55 states now, if we go by the African Union statistics. The different cultures, different tribes, different modalities, political systems, very often they were afflicted by corruption, coups, and conflicts. But today, Africa is gearing up. And as was mentioned earlier, it was the Continental Free Trade Agreement that has come about. So they are beginning to write their own destiny. So in our outreach, something that is very important is to understand that every country has its own specialty in Africa. Each country has its own demands. Fortunately, India has tremendous goodwill there. So that reserve of goodwill was not capitalized the way we should have done in the past. Fortunately now, under the current government, Modi 1.0 and Modi 2.0, the biggest problem that existed in our relations with Africa as a continent and the countries in particular, that we stopped at South Africa, which was more like a tourism center. So every minister, prime minister, everybody wanted to go only to Africa. It was the other countries were neglected after Pandit Nehru visited several of them. We were in Nigeria and it took us, Ambassador Vishnathan is here. It was after 45 years that we had the first visit of the Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh. And that too for a day. With great difficulty we were able to manage that. And if Nigeria, from there we get about 12% of our energy security in a way. We can get much more. We had the president there who have studied in India. So we talked about a lot of African students have the maximum in this country. They have certain problems. They need to be addressed, especially their assimilation in the society, which is extremely important because there are almost 13 or 14 currently, the heads of state or government who studied in India. And therefore, it is extremely important that they have a good experience in India, especially at the people-to-people level, which is extremely important. so that they become really the ambassadors of India in their own countries. I have myself dealt with one when I was posted in Libya. A friend of mine who used to be with me in JNU, Ali Zidane, became the Prime Minister of Libya. And that changed the course of our relationship that was going really south in the country. So that is extremely important for us. Secondly, the things that we commit to Africa. And I was so happy to hear your statistics. But today the Africans are looking at trade, not aid, really. So they are also beginning to dry up from the lines of credit. Many countries are not interested or do not want in the same terms. They try to negotiate with us, saying that China is giving us this rate, you are giving us this rate. So they like grants, they like joint ventures, they like investments. So that's where I think we'll be able to get much more traction in future. That is just by way, since you happen to be here, Excellency. So Africa is extremely important. I personally feel, having lived there for almost a dozen years and serving in almost a dozen countries in one way or the other, that the second half of this century is very likely to be the Afro-Asian century. And we need to work together. Why I say so is that by 2050, Africa will have 675 million working class people, which will be more than India and China. And that is where the real thing, they are resource rich. They are conscious of their strength now. They are getting united and trying to address the issues that have afflicted them in the past. So therefore, I feel that India, which has tremendous reservoir, is adopting new methodologies. And the Prime Minister's, for the first time actually, we have outlined the Africa policy in the 10 guiding principles that Prime Minister Modi expostulated in Kampala when he addressed the parliament there. So they are the extremely important thing. The Africans believe us. It's for us now to take it. The economic dimension of our relationship is way below potential. $60-70 billion trade is nothing with Africa. That needs to grow. That can grow if our industry goes there, if our businessmen go there. So that is one more thing that we'll have to work towards. Well, West Asia, Modi 2.0 we are talking about, but in fact it was 1.0 that I feel personally, having observed it rather closely, that this was the biggest foreign policy success for Prime Minister Modi as far as West Asia is concerned. We have had excellent relations now with almost, and the personal relations, because with the Arabs the most important thing is personal relations. If you have good relations at the highest level, at the official level, at the P2P level, you can get anything that you want. Once the trust is established, and that is something that has happened in the past. We have also dehyphenated our policy vis-a-vis Palestine and Israel. So the Prime Minister Modi, when in UK, he spoke about the policy that I'll go to Saudi Arabia and I'll go to Iran if my interests demand. I'll go to Palestine, I'll go to Israel. That is something, that kind of autonomous decision-making in our foreign policy was missing for a while. That has now been acquired. And this is extremely important because those countries are also looking for they are considering India as one of the major partners, a real partner for progress. We are looking at huge investments coming in. In fact, almost there was a race to confer some kind of an award on Prime Minister Modi by almost all the leaders, whether it's UAE, Saudi Arabia, everywhere he goes, Palestine. The highest award on him was conferred by these countries and the governments. That shows the kind of faith they have in India. But today things are also changing in those countries. Unfortunately, this is the country that is afflicted with, again, conflicts. Be it Saudi Arabia, whether it's Iran, whether it's between Israel and the others, whether it is Yemen war. There is a big problem. And this problem actually directly affects India. It's our extended neighborhood. We depend for almost 70% of our energy needs from the region. We have 8 million Indians, huge remittances, safety, security, stability, the passages, the trade. So for us, it is existential. And it is extremely important for us that the region remains stable. Now, what can we do about it is a major question. And I think whether it is Syria, whether any other conflict regions, eventually, as India grows in size and stature, those are the challenges that we'll have to confront and think about the positions that we are going to take. And that is what in my view, one of the things that Modi 2.0 will have to deal with, and deal with effectively. We have already seen a little bit of a upsetting Iran when we discontinued importing oil from there. How we were banking a great deal on Chabahar port. But today we don't know, because suddenly the peeved Iranians would invite the Pakistanis to come and use Chabahar. They will ask Chinese to come and use Chabahar. So your strategic asset on which you were dependent for your Afghanistan and Central Asia policy gets into a little bit of turmoil. And hence, it is important for us to decide on the policies, whether we are going to remain neutral. Can you be neutral in this world? Those are the things that are going to be the bigger challenges, in my view, during the next 3-4 years. But Prime Minister Modi is going to Saudi Arabia the second time. Saudi Arabia has recently invested a great deal. So those countries are looking at it. But then you have another axis that has emerged, the Turkey, Qatar, and Iran, which is a very different axis compared to the Saudi, the UAE, the Oman, and Israel. So that's where the competition is prevailing. And so far we have been able to wade through it very effectively. And I'll have to see and watch and hope that we'll continue to have these kind of equanimous but very close ties with almost all countries in the region. But that is a challenge that I guess in coming times we'll have to confront. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Trigunayat, for pointing out how India's diplomatic outreach to Africa has acquired an unprecedented tempo in the last few years, and the future of our relations with the two emerging regions of Africa and Gulf looking brighter than ever. Now I invite our last speaker of the day, Deputy Chief of Mission, Embassy of Russia, Mr. Roman Babushkin, to share briefly his thoughts on India-Russia development partnership.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Secretary Tirumurti, Your Excellencies, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen and friends, dear Manish, thank you very much for inviting me to such an important event. I feel very honored to share dais with such big dignitaries and the legendary diplomats like Kanwal Sibal, like Anil Vadva, like Anil Trigunayat. This is our teachers, because this is my third posting in India, and when I came here as a young diplomat in 2007, these people were somebody who were, so much well reputed that we can call it that that's something like unachievable heights and unachievable wisdom, and very grateful for sharing with us your vision about the Indian foreign policy, which we dedicate our life to here, working here in New Delhi. From the point of view of the achievements of the Indian diplomacy at present, we can definitely call the Indian-Russia cooperation as a development cooperation, because we support each other development journey. And our ties historically are based on similar civilizational values: time-tested friendship, mutual trust, common understanding, and proximity of approaches on the fundamental issues. Progressing in the entire gamut of India-Russia relations is a strong foreign policy priority for both countries, and that is why our ties have successfully coped with these turbulent realities of the contemporary world. While we are expanding our partnership in many areas, nuclear power and military and technical cooperation constitute main pillars of our ties. Russia, as of now, is the only foreign country in India which is practically involved in construction of nuclear reactors. The flagship project, the Russian-designed Kudankulam nuclear power plant in Tamil Nadu, which is comprising of 6 blocks, and the 2 first units are already operational, generating low-cost power for local customers. There is also a great scope of localization and joint production, as well as cooperation with third countries. In military and technical area, there is an extraordinary mutual interest, proceeding from the fact that up to the 70% of the hardware the Indian Army used, provided from the Soviet Union and Russia. We have got the intergovernmental agreement aimed at pushing forward joint development and production of military equipment and spare parts. The overall amount of current deals is exceeding $14.5 billion. And we move to a great scope of localization and production, and joint production. Up to 80% of the hardware equipment can be produced in India under the current deal being implemented right now. Starting with the support of the Soviet Union in the Indian industrialization, now we have reached the advanced science and technology and innovation partnership, covering such areas such telecommunications, robotics, artificial intelligence, nanotechnologies, space, pharmacy, and others. Now we are also speaking about opportunities of cooperation between national innovation ecosystems. The 20th Jubilee Russia-India Summit on 4th to 5th September in Vladivostok. During the summit, the focus was made on enhancing cooperation in the Russian Far East, which is rich in natural resources and industrial capacities. Preferential tax regimes and dedicated government support measures have been introduced to ensure very attractive business and investment climate there. The announcement by Prime Minister Modi of the $1 billion dedicated credit line can be seen in this context. Moreover, leaders decided to expand oil supplies from Russia to India with the aim to prepare relevant long-term arrangements. Along with cooking coal production, gas fuel, alternative energy, shipbuilding, timber, and diamond industry, we also expect solid developments in the area of regional infrastructure. We are working on the re-establishment of the Chennai-Vladivostok direct sea route, along with the raising efficiency of the international north-south transport corridor. Moreover, we are investing a lot to an early conclusion of the free trade agreement between India and the Eurasian Economic Union, which will also stimulate overall economic exchanges between all the participants of the coming arrangement. We are committed to ensure trade facilitation through the extended use of national currencies, volumes of which have increased 5-fold in recent years, up to 32% in 2018. In international cooperation, our priority is to create favorable conditions for national development in our 2 countries and to support global sustainable development efforts. We actively promote a truly multipolar world with the greater role of major developing countries. We are absolutely like-minded in terms of vital importance of strengthening the United Nations and resolving challenges collectively by political and diplomatic means according to the international law and the UN Charter. Subsequently, we are strongly against any unilateral and geopolitically motivated actions and illegal extraterritorial sanctions, which create instability and unpredictability. We adhere to this approach in G20, BRICS, and other mechanisms. Being member states of BRICS, we believe it is absolutely possible to achieve the goal of the constructive polycentrism, where such principles as respect for sovereignty and legitimate national interests, non-interference in the domestic affairs prevail over zero-sum games, attempts to regime change, sanctions, and other unilateral policies, which are often wrapped up with the artificial concept of a rules-based world order. As the 11th BRICS summit in Brazil is approaching, we are focusing on implementation of initiatives proposed by Brazil, which was highlighted by Ambassador. So, but importantly, what is also demonstrates the the contribution of BRICS to the development strategies of all our 5 countries is that in the sphere of finance we aim to contribute to the reform of the global economic governance, strengthening of the new development bank, setting up national currencies bond fund. Along with that, we are progressing in creation of the Russia proposed energy research cooperation platform. In the framework of SCO, we are working systematically to contribute to the efforts of states in the Eurasian region to put in place a modern security configuration that would create equal and broad opportunities for advancing trade, economic, and investment cooperation and facilitate the establishment of integrated and political space. The dialogue in the leaders-led RIC, Russia-India-China format, aimed at strengthening confidence and mutual understanding, has good potential. Russia's special and privileged strategic partnership with India, just like Russia's comprehensive and strategic cooperation with China, are the 2 indispensable pillars of stability in Eurasia. We encourage our partners to create connectivity between the regional organizations in Eurasia in order to more efficiently manage challenges and seize the opportunities by creating the greater Eurasia partnership. Next year, we expect many high and highest level engagements, which would provide many opportunities for Russia and India to go ahead with the development partnership. In 2020, Russia will host more than 120 events during the Russian presidency in BRICS and numerous meetings as the chair country in the SCO. Along with traditional annual bilateral summit with India, we are looking forward to welcoming Prime Minister Modi to attend celebrations on 9th of May in Moscow's Red Square, dedicated to 75th anniversary of the victory in the Great Patriotic War over fascist Germany, which was the major contribution to the end of the Second World War. Moreover, in 2020, we will celebrate the 20th anniversary of the declaration of the strategic partnership between Russia and India, and 10th anniversary since Russia and India became special and privileged strategic partners. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have come towards the end of the program. We love to have a last one round of question maybe. Those who wish to ask question to the esteemed panelists may introduce themselves and identify themselves because the program is being webcast live. Anyone has question, they're most welcome to ask. Yeah. Another 10 minutes maybe. Okay.
My question is to Wadhwa sir. My name is Suman Singh. I am a student of IGNOU and I am currently preparing for competitive exams. Sir, you spoke about free trade agreement and its abuse. And you said that we need a trigger like something so that it stops if somebody is abusing it or violating it. If you, sir, could give an example of it, sir.
Okay, we'll take some more questions. Yeah.
From Hindustan Times. My question is to Ambassador Sibal. Sir, you have a great reputation for answering questions straight, and that is most undiplomatic, but that's very good for us who ask such questions. If we look at India's China relationship over the last 40 years, from 1979, when Foreign Minister Vajpayee visited China, till 2019, I believe that we have made very little progress, almost no progress on the border issue. And in the last 10 years, it has come to such a point that China does not want to discuss the border. Even in Mamlapuram, we discussed everything, art, culture, sun, star, ocean, but we did not discuss the border in any substantial manner. So, my question to you is, please could you tell us, are they really interested in settling the border dispute? And second is, What will it take for India to force them to look at this option a little bit more sincerely?
Okay, thanks. Anyone else? One more? Okay, we go ahead with answers then. We come back later. All right, sir. Ambassador Wadhwa, followed by Ambassador Sibal. You have the mic on your...
So this is a mechanism which has been proposed by India in the negotiations in the last round, essentially to make sure that there is no sudden surge in exports from a particular country of a particular commodity, so that it doesn't help, affect the economy of India. And that particular industry is not damaged, because by the time you seek redressal, etc., there's a certain time frame which is required for that, and that also sometimes may not be satisfactorily settled. So there is a certain volume of that commodity which is proposed when the tariff lines are decided. And it doesn't happen for everything, but happens, let's say, for 10% of sensitive items. There's always a sensitive list in the negotiations. And when there is a surge above that volume, then automatically there's a trigger mechanism which kicks in, and your tariffs that you pay are much more than the normal, which has been agreed upon in negotiations.
Well, I thought that after 41 years in diplomacy, I learned to be diplomatic. But you believe, let me see how undiplomatic I can be in response to your question. I think China is not interested in solving the border issue. They have a pressure point on India, which they use periodically to put us on the defensive. And since, relatively speaking, we are weaker militarily in terms of border defenses, and also our public gets very agitated when there are reports of Chinese incursions. So China finds it very useful to play on India's weaknesses and vulnerabilities, and keep us in a sense on the back foot in terms of our overall relationship. Number one. Number two, if you look at their statements, they have been consistently saying that it is a leftover of problems left from history, and it'll take. We should leave it to the future generations to resolve this issue. In other words, that they don't see that the time is ripe to address this issue seriously and resolve it. And since I was personally involved also in some of these negotiations in the past, I have seen that they keep changing their positions. They agree on something, and then they violate that agreement. For instance, in the 1993-1996 agreements on confidence building and peace and tranquility on the border, we had made a very reasonable proposal. That look, we are having this problem of incursions and this and that. And there are differing perceptions on where the line of actual control is. So the best step would be to agree on some mechanism where we can identify what are the perceptions on each side of where the line of actual control lies, which meant that they produce a map and give us on the map what their perception is with regard to the line of control and line of actual control. And we'll also give them a map where we will tell them on the map where we think the line of actual control is. And we identify the middle sector, the western sector, and the eastern sector. The middle sector was the easiest. So maps were exchanged. When it came to the western sector, they refused to accept the maps. I will not go into the reasons for that. They had no reason to do that. But I think what they had in their mind was that they made a big mistake in agreeing to this. Because if we ultimately, let me put it differently, in their view, I think, they felt that the whole border issue will get narrowed down to the different perceptions on the line of control, which meant that they can't claim Arunachal Pradesh because that is not, it's not under their actual control. So they walked out of the mechanism. Then when we went, and I was there when we went with our Prime Minister to China, we set up the special representatives mechanism. So the whole objective was that we will no longer get into this debate about history and tradition and legality and stuff like that. We look at the border issue in strategic terms, in political terms, and deal with it on that basis. And we'll have two people of confidence who will report directly to the leadership on both sides in complete secrecy with no briefings to the press. Now, we've had 21 meetings of the SR mechanisms and nothing has been produced. In fact, after the 17th or 18th meeting, it was agreed that this mechanism will no longer be used only for addressing the border issue, but will look at the overall strategic relationship. In 2005, we agreed to the guiding parameters and guidelines for solving the border issue. Again, I don't want to go into details, but they have violated those. The problem is that when we said that we should deal with this issue politically, they have brought in the whole issue of Arunachal Pradesh, and at a minimum, Tawang. Tawang is not under actual control, but politically can they raise this issue. So they have distorted the entire content of our agreements in a way that blocks all progress. Now, I don't see any visible progress on the border issue in the years ahead, and I'm afraid we'll have to live the situation. I think, and I'll end with this, the effort on both sides, and that gives credit to both governments, that we should avoid a conflict on the border. Because if it's an actual conflict, and if lives are lost, if actual firing takes place, that then can degenerate it into a much bigger conflict. So what we are concentrating on is border management. So we've had a series of agreements, 1993, 1996, 2006, 9, 2013. Each time we meet, we develop more and more mechanisms of managing the border in order to avoid a conflict, or agree on protocols on the military side so that even if there's face-to-face confrontation, it doesn't degenerate into a conflict. So I think we will have to live with this situation. And finally, I'll end by saying that we signed all these agreements and we all talk the language of, both sides talk the language of peace and good relationship. But there is no peace dividend that we've got from all the agreements that we have signed with China. On the contrary, we have to spend more and more money on our border defenses, build border roads, open up advanced landing grounds, place our high-end equipment near the border, etc., etc. In other words, in fact, a lot of pressure has been put on us in order to improve our defenses and spend a lot more money on defending ourselves. So in the context of any genuine settlement of the border or progress towards that, it should not have been the situation that actually we have to build up more and more defenses against China.
Banlal, if anyone has more questions, otherwise we'll conclude. You? Okay. Very brief, yeah?
Good evening, sir. My name is Kunal. I am from PTI. Yesterday, Defense Minister Rajnath Singh made a statement on India-China relationship, and he said that there are perception differences as far as the border issue is concerned, but both sides have managed it, rather responsibly and with proper sensibility. Do you agree with that statement? And how do you take this statement, sir, in the light of what you mentioned today and the current issue between the two countries, sir?
I just concluded what I said with that precisely. I think Rajnath Singh is right, that both sides have acted, even if we have serious differences with China on the border issue, we have to admit the fact that even they are not interested in an actual conflict on the border. So we are cooperating in terms of border mechanisms, and we have, until now, in 1987 we had a conflict. 62 was a big conflict, but 87 we had a confrontation. And in Doklam, we were face to face, but we avoided a confrontation. So the border management mechanisms have worked well, and the fact that the top leadership is in contact with each other provides a good buffer to any rash actions by the PLA on the Chinese side. So I think Rajnath Singh, as I said, he's right in saying that both sides have acted responsibly and managed the border well. As regards perceptional differences, lately I think our government has been saying that let's go back to the earlier agreement that we had of exchanging maps on both sides with regard to our perceptions of where the line of actual control lies. We've been pressing China on this, but they have not responded. To my mind, that's the best way out. You identify them, you narrow them down, see what the pockets are, and then negotiate a border agreement and settle the border on that basis. But that means they can't claim Arunachal Pradesh.
Okay, the last question.
Sir, again on India-China relationship, and I am Sanjeev Srivastava. I'm a researcher on foreign policy issues. Sir, how significant and how important would be the U.S. factor if we have to successfully manage our ties with China in times to come?
Well, let me ask you the question. Has the United States been able to solve the issues in the South China Sea? Look, they have military bases there. They have positioned armed forces there. They have alliances there. And under their very nose, China has built effectively military bases in the South China Sea. They have, out of rocks and reefs, they have built islands, and they have placed their armed force. They have placed their missiles and their air force and this and that. And the United States has not been able to do anything. Look at the Scarborough Shoal incident, where there was an agreement. The Philippines withdrew. The Chinese violated the agreement and occupied the Scarborough Shoal, and the United States couldn't do anything. So if in an area where they have treaty commitments and defense agreements and bases and military forces, and they've not been able to, how should I say, counter China's illegal behavior according to international law, then can we really expect the United States to be able to, how should I say, confront China, counter China in areas and issues of Indian interest? But let me add another point before I finish, which is that the United States takes the position that we are not going to make a judgment on the legalities of the claims of either side. What we want is that there should be no enforcement of any claim by either party by force. So, in other words, they keep a neutral position with regard to sovereignty issues. Now, our problem with China on the land borders are sovereignty issues. So the United States is not going to take a position on that. Although they recognize the McMahon line, but on Ladakh, in the Ladakh area, they don't say anything. And in any case, we don't want to involve them in any. We don't want a military conflict with China, and therefore we're not thinking of involving the United States on our side in any conflict with China. But the fact remains that you can't rely on the United States. You have to fight your own battles. You have to strengthen yourself and build your deterrent capabilities, which we are doing, and then hope for the best.
Okay, so any brief comments, Ambassador Vishwanathan, Mr. Mehta? Anyone has some comment or otherwise? Otherwise, we conclude the program. I think this has been a fabulous discussion, marathon 2.5 hours. Ideally, in terms of the range of themes being discussed, this was probably qualified for a day-long discussion. It's an amazing feat that within the space of 2.5 hours, we have virtually covered the entire world with expertise from diverse regions. It's absolutely amazing, and I'm thankful above all, to begin with, to Secretary Economic Relations. It's very rare for the guest of honor to sit through the entire discussion. And I believe this underscores the quality of the discussion we have had today. So I'm really enormously thankful from the depth of my heart for Secretary T.S. Tirumurti to be with us throughout this discussion and accepting our invitation. I am deeply thankful to all the speakers for taking time off. You know, it's very difficult to organize an evening like this. On any given day in this city, there are 10 different things happening. To get them over is a challenge, to have such esteemed panelists. So I'm deeply thankful to Ambassador Sibal, Ambassador Wadhwa, Ambassador Trigunayat, His Excellency Ambassador of Brazil to India, His Excellency Ambassador of Algeria to India, Mr. Roman Babushkin, and last but not the least, to this fabulous audience. I admire, really, from depth of my heart, I really thank you for sticking right through till the end. I hope you found the discussion useful, and I also wish to announce that we'll continue. This is kind of kicking off a series of discussion on diplomacy for a new India. I think under this broad rubric, we will be exploring the organic linkage between diplomacy and development, and above all, India's ongoing rise as an important power and what it means for the rest of the world. Thank you, audience. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. We are deeply grateful to all of you. Thank you.